Winter did not take him when his wife died. It only taught him how to keep breathing. A lonely mountain town, a police officer walking through grief, and one German shepherd who refused to let the snow decide their ending. He thought the mountain was empty, until a light appeared where no light should exist, until a house buried beneath the storm began to feel alive, until the dog heard something no human could hear. What they found on that frozen ridge would change the fate of the mountain, the town, and one broken heart forever. Before the story begins, tell us where you are watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments and stay with us, because this is a story about loss, love, and the quiet miracle that waits for those who listen. Silver Pine Valley, Colorado, did not ease into winter. It surrendered to it. On the morning Evelyn Cross died, the sky above the mountain town was a dull, heavy gray, the kind that pressed low against the rooftops and made even the tallest pines look small. Snow had been falling since before dawn, not the playful kind that children wait for, but a relentless, quiet curtain that erased roads, softened buildings, and turned the world into something hushed and fragile. Main Street lay half-buried beneath it, shop windows glowing weakly behind frost, the traffic lights blinking through the storm like tired eyes refusing sleep. Officer Nolan Cross was parked near the eastern ridge when the call came in. Nolan was 41 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame shaped by years of patrol work and old discipline. His hair, once dark brown, was now threaded with premature silver at the temples. His face carried the calm weight of a man who had learned to keep fear and hope locked behind the same door. His eyes, a muted steel blue, were observant but tired, the kind of tired that came from too many long nights and too few reasons to go home early. He wore the uniform easily, not because it was comfortable, but because he had grown into it, the way mountains grow into their stone. In the passenger seat sat Luca. The German shepherd was 7 years old, large and powerfully built, with a thick double coat of black and tan fur that caught snow like ash. His chest was broad, his legs long and steady, and his amber eyes watched the world with an intelligence that seemed far older than his years. A faint dusting of white had begun to touch his muzzle, softening the hard lines of his face. Luca was not playful. He was not loud. He was deliberate, loyal, and deeply attuned to Nolan in the way only animals who have walked beside grief can be. The voice on the radio was careful. Too careful. Nolan heard it immediately. There were no sirens in the words, no panic, just an unnatural calm. A single vehicle accident. North Slope. Visibility near zero. The address was already burned into Nolan's memory before the dispatcher finished. Evelyn's route home. Evelyn Cross had been 39 years old. She was tall and slender, with long dark hair she usually kept pulled into a loose knot that never stayed quite in place. Her skin was pale and quick to freckle in summer, her eyes a warm brown that reflected more than they revealed. She moved through the world quietly, not because she lacked confidence, but because she had learned that listening often mattered more than being heard. To strangers she appeared reserved, observant, polite without being distant. To Nolan, she was something else entirely. Warm laughter in the kitchen at midnight, soft teasing when he folded laundry too neatly, patient persistence whenever he tried to avoid a conversation that scared him. She worked for a small climate research institute outside town, a job that suited her nature. She believed in understanding systems, in protecting what could be preserved, and in asking questions long after others had decided the answers were too complicated. Somewhere along the years, that habit of asking questions had deepened. After her mother's passing 3 winters ago, Evelyn became quieter still, more focused. She spent evenings reading reports, tracing maps with her finger, writing notes in the margins of old notebooks. Nolan had assumed grief worked that way for her. It pulled her inward. He had not pressed. He had loved her for how she carried her silence. When Nolan reached the ridge, the scene was already lit by emergency lights and falling snow. Evelyn's car lay twisted at the edge of the mountain road, one side crushed against the guardrail, the windshield fractured into 1,000 frozen stars. The wind swept through the open door, scattering snow across the empty seat. Paramedics stood nearby, their breath fogging the air, their faces grave. Nolan stepped out of the patrol car. His boots sank into the snow. The world had narrowed into the sound of his own heartbeat and the quiet ticking of the engine behind him. He did not run. He walked the way he had always walked toward difficult things. They told him she had died on impact. The words were gentle, they always are. After that, time stopped behaving properly. The funeral passed in slow motion. Snow fell again, as if the mountain itself had chosen to mark her leaving. Nolan stood beside the grave in his dress uniform, hands clasped behind his back out of habit. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply stared at the wooden box that held the woman who had once filled their house with light. Luca sat at his side, his body pressed against Nolan's leg, a steady weight anchoring him to the ground. In the weeks that followed, Nolan continued working. He woke before dawn, brewed coffee, fed Luca, and drove the familiar roads of Silver Pine Valley. The town returned to its rhythms. Children walked to school wrapped in scarves. Shopkeepers shoveled snow from their doorways. Life did what it always did. It moved on. Nolan did not. At night, the house was unbearable in its quiet. Evelyn's coat still hung by the door. Her books remained stacked on the coffee table, the corners of pages folded where she had stopped reading. Nolan slept on the edge of the bed, as if leaving room for her might somehow make it true. Luca slept on the floor beside him, alert even in dreams. 3 months passed. Winter tightened its grip. Snowdrifts grew higher along the roads. The mountains loomed, white and endless. One night, during a routine patrol along the eastern ridge, Nolan pulled the cruiser onto the shoulder to watch the storm roll across the valley. Snow fell in thick, deliberate sheets, blurring the outline of the town below. The world looked smaller from up there, as if everything that had ever mattered could be contained in a single breath. Luca lifted his head. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture. His ears angled forward, his body tensed. Nolan noticed, but he did not yet understand. Luca stood, his paws pressed against the door, his breath coming faster. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a bark, not a growl, something between concern and urgency. "What is it, boy?" Nolan murmured. Luca did not look at him. His gaze was fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the shoulder of the road, where the snow seemed to fall a little differently, a little heavier, as if hiding something. Nolan followed his eyes. At first, he saw nothing but white and shadow. Then, faintly, impossibly, he saw it. A light. Not the harsh beam of a vehicle or the steady glow of a house. A flicker. Weak. Uncertain. As though someone had struck a match inside the storm and hoped it would be enough. Luca let out a single sharp bark. Nolan started the engine. They drove toward the trees, tires crunching over ice and snow. The light vanished, then reappeared, then vanished again. The forest swallowed the sound of the cruiser. The world narrowed to the falling snow, the dark trunks of pines, and the quiet certainty in Luca's eyes. When Nolan finally stopped the vehicle, he turned off the engine. The silence pressed in immediately, thick and complete. Luca jumped down from the seat, landing in the snow with a soft thud. He did not hesitate. He moved forward, nose low, tail steady, as if following a path only he could see. Nolan followed, boots sinking deep, breath burning in the cold. They did not find the source of the light that night. They found only the edge of the forest and the rising slope of the mountain, buried beneath snow and shadow. After several minutes, Luca stopped and turned back toward Nolan. The dog's posture had changed. He was no longer urgent. He was watchful. Nolan placed a hand on Luca's shoulder. The fur was warm beneath his glove. "All right," he whispered. "We'll come back." They returned to the cruiser and drove down the ridge, the storm closing behind them as if the mountain itself had drawn a curtain. That night, Nolan lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees outside his house. Luca paced once, then settled at the foot of the bed, his amber eyes open, unblinking. The mountain was silent, but something, somewhere, beyond the snow, had begun to pay attention. And Nolan Cross, who had believed there was nothing left waiting for him in this world, did not yet know that winter was about to give him back a purpose he thought he had buried with Evelyn. The storm did not leave when morning came. It only changed its voice. Where the night had howled, the dawn whispered, the wind brushing snow from branch to branch like fingers passing over the pages of a book that no one had finished reading. Silver Pine Valley lay buried beneath a new skin of white. Roofs softened, fences erased, roads turned into pale rivers of ice and memory. From the ridge above town, the mountains looked closer than they ever had, as if winter had drawn them inward to watch what the people below would do next. Officer Nolan Cross returned to the eastern ridge before the sun had fully risen. The patrol radio crackled quietly beside him, but the town was still asleep, wrapped in the fragile peace that only snow could create. Lucas sat in the passenger seat, his broad shoulders pressed against the door. Amber eyes fixed on the line of trees ahead. The dog's posture was different from the night before. Not urgent, not anxious, expectant. Nolan parked where he had stopped during the storm. The same stretch of road, the same wall of pines, the same quiet. "All right," Nolan murmured, pulling on his gloves. "Let's see what you were trying to show me." Luca was already moving. He leapt down from the cruiser, landing softly in the snow, then waited just long enough to make sure Nolan was following. The forest accepted them without resistance. Snow clung to Nolan's boots and the hem of his coat. The air was so cold it felt thin, as if every breath had to be earned. They reached the place where the light had flickered the night before. In daylight, it looked no different from the rest of the slope, just snow, trees, rock, and shadow. Nolan scanned the ground. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing that should have been there. Luca lowered his head and moved forward, slow and deliberate, nose skimming the surface of the snow. He paused, sniffed, then changed direction. Nolan followed, trusting the rhythm of the dog's movements more than his own eyes. The terrain began to change. The slope rose more sharply, the trees thinning where stone pushed through the soil. Then Nolan saw it. Not the light. The shape. A structure. It was barely visible at first, only a line where the snow did not fall quite the same way, where the hill seemed to fold inward rather than rise. Nolan stepped closer. The outline of a roof emerged, not resting on the ground but carved into it, earth and timber stitched together by time. Snow piled thick against its sides, covering most of the walls, leaving only a narrow section of dark wood exposed. "A house," Nolan whispered. Luca stopped several feet from the structure and looked back at him. The dog's ears were forward, his body still. Waiting. Nolan brushed snow from the door with his gloved hand. The wood beneath was solid, darkened by age but unbroken. A simple iron handle hung from the center, cold and unyielding. Nolan hesitated. He did not believe in omens, but something about the silence made him careful. He turned the handle. The door opened. Warmth spilled out. Not the gentle warmth of a fire, not the stale heat of an abandoned building, but something steady, neutral, almost alive. Nolan stood frozen in the doorway, breath fogging outside while the air inside remained clear. He stepped in. The interior was dim but intact. Stone flooring beneath his boots. Walls of packed earth reinforced with heavy timber beams. The smell of soil and old wood, clean and undisturbed. There was no frost on the walls, no condensation on the windows. The temperature did not match the storm outside. Luca entered behind him, slower now, his breathing deepening as he crossed the threshold. The dog paused, then moved forward, sniffing the air, the floor, the walls. His tail remained still. They explored the first level carefully. Narrow windows cut into the walls reflected pale morning light. Old shelves were carved directly into the clay, their surfaces worn smooth by hands that had worked here long before Nolan had ever been born. Rusted tools lay arranged neatly on a table, not abandoned, but left with intention. "This place," Nolan murmured. "Someone built this to last." Luca stopped near the far wall. His posture changed. The muscles in his shoulders tightened. His head lowered slightly as he released a low, quiet sound that vibrated through the space. Not a growl, a warning. Nolan stepped closer. The wall looked like the rest. Packed earth, smooth in places, reinforced by timber. No cracks, no visible damage. But the air felt different there. He could not explain how, only that it did. Nolan placed his gloved palm against the surface. The wall was warm, not from sunlight, not from a fire, warm from within. Luca met his eyes. "Yeah," Nolan said quietly. "I feel it too." They did not explore further. Not yet. Nolan backed toward the door, unsettled by how little the space matched the storm outside. He stepped into the snow. The cold returned instantly, biting through his coat. He looked back at the structure, at the way it disappeared into the hillside, as if the mountain itself had agreed to keep its secret. Nolan closed the door. The hike back to the cruiser was slow. The wind had picked up, carrying snow across the slope in thin white sheets. Nolan kept glancing over his shoulder. The house vanished behind the trees without ceremony. They returned to Silver Pine Valley before noon. The town was awake now, the day resuming its careful movements. Nolan parked outside his home and sat in the cruiser for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel, the image of that door opening replaying in his mind. That afternoon, Nolan tried to continue his routine. He cleaned his equipment. He answered a few routine calls. He stopped at the small grocery store on Main Street for coffee and bread. People nodded when they saw him, the same nods he had returned for years. Nothing in the town had changed, but he had. When night came, the snow returned. Not heavy, not loud, just enough to soften the edges of the world again. Nolan stood on his porch and watched it fall. Luca sat beside him, his body pressed against Nolan's leg. "You weren't imagining it, were you?" Nolan asked. Luca's ears twitched. That night, Nolan dreamed for the first time since Evelyn's funeral. He stood inside the mountain, though the walls were not stone but earth and wood, shaped by hands he could not see. The air was warm and still. Luca stood several feet ahead, staring into a shadowed corridor. Then the dog turned and looked at him, not alert, not afraid, but waiting. Nolan woke with his heart pounding. The house was silent. The snow outside glowed faintly beneath the moon. Luca sat upright beside the bed, already awake, his amber eyes fixed on the dark. Nolan did not go back to sleep. Before dawn, he pulled on his coat and boots. Luca followed him outside. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the storm easing its grip on the valley. Nolan looked toward the ridge. "We're going back," he said. Luca's tail gave a single slow sweep. They drove into the waking mountain as the first light spilled across the snow. And somewhere beneath the white silence, something old and patient waited to be understood. The road up the eastern ridge felt narrower than it had the day before. The snow had settled into the grooves of the tires like chalk pressed into old scars, and the trees leaned closer, their branches heavy with frost. Nolan drove slowly, both hands steady on the wheel, his breath rising in pale clouds inside the cruiser. Luca sat upright in the passenger seat, posture tall and watchful, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead as though he already knew where they were going. They did not speak. They did not need to. When Nolan cut the engine near the same stretch of trees, the silence returned at once, thick and complete. He stepped from the vehicle and pulled his coat tighter, feeling the bite of winter against his skin. The wind had shifted overnight, leaving the mountain unnaturally still. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. Luca jumped down and led the way, moving with quiet certainty through the snow. The slope rose, the ground stiff beneath Nolan's boots, until the outline of the house appeared again, folded into the hillside as if it had grown there. In daylight, the structure revealed its careful design more clearly, the way each level stepped backward into the earth, the way the roof was not a roof at all, but a continuation of the mountain itself, layered with soil, moss, and old winter grass. The windows were narrow, positioned deliberately, their glass reflecting the pale sky. Nolan rested his hand on the door before opening it, the memory of that strange warmth returning. When the door swung inward, the air inside greeted him with the same steady calm as before. Luca entered first this time, his body relaxing slightly once he crossed the threshold, as if he had been waiting to come home to something he had not yet named. They explored more carefully now. Nolan walked each level, noting the subtle shifts in temperature, the way the upper tier felt faintly warmer than the lower, the way the air moved almost imperceptibly through hidden channels in the walls. He found a narrow passage angled upward between two sections of timber and followed it, discovering vents carved directly into the packed earth, their edges smoothed by time. This was not decay. This was intention. On the middle tier, he noticed a series of shallow shelves carved into the wall. Most were empty, but a few still held objects too deliberate to be discarded. A rusted compass, a length of braided wire, a small metal tin sealed with careful hands. Nolan did not open the tin. He did not yet feel permitted. Luca moved ahead of him, then stopped, his ears lifting as they reached the far end of the chamber. The same wall. The same place where the warmth concentrated. Nolan crouched and pressed his palm against the surface again. The warmth remained. It did not waver. He felt it in the bones of his hand, steady and alive. "That's not the sun," he murmured. "That's something else." Luca's eyes did not leave the wall. Nolan stepped back, unsettled but unwilling to push further. Instead, he turned his attention outward, the way he always had when the answers were not yet ready. He locked the door behind them and returned to the cruiser, his mind already shifting from instinct to investigation. By afternoon, Nolan sat at the narrow pine table in his kitchen, laptop open, yellow legal pad beside it, a cup of coffee gone cold near his elbow. Luca lay stretched across the floor, long body relaxed, ears twitching occasionally at sounds Nolan could not hear. Outside, the valley darkened early as the winter sun slid behind the mountains. Nolan began with public records. The structure did not appear under residential listings. It was not categorized as a cabin, not a shed, not an outbuilding. It existed in the margins of the system, classified only as a non-habitable wooden structure under outdated zoning codes last inspected decades ago. No recent photographs, no updated survey. He traced ownership next. The land itself belonged to the county, but the structure was tied to a private trust. The name attached to the trust stopped him cold. Evelyn Cross. Nolan read it twice, then again. His throat tightened as though winter itself had reached inside him. Evelyn had never mentioned owning property in the mountains. She had never spoken of a trust. She had never hinted at unfinished business tied to a place she had clearly taken steps to protect. Nolan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, the weight of realization pressing down slowly, without drama. The long evenings Evelyn had spent reading old maps, the quiet requests for copies of land surveys and engineering records, the way she had lingered on certain articles about climate resilience and experimental structures. He had assumed it was academic curiosity. He had been wrong. He reached for the phone. Margaret Hensley answered on the fourth ring. Evelyn's mother was in her early 60s, small and compact. With steel gray hair cut close to her head and a voice worn thin by years of careful endurance. She had raised Evelyn alone after her husband's death, and it showed in the way she spoke, direct, economical, never indulgent. When Nolan mentioned the house, Margaret was silent for a long moment. "So," she said finally, "it found you." "What is it?" Nolan asked. Margaret exhaled slowly. "It belonged to my aunt, Eleanor Hensley. She lived up there briefly, a long time ago. There were arguments, stories. No one ever wanted to claim the place. We passed it down the line and pretended it wasn't there." "Why didn't Evelyn tell me?" "Because once you say something out loud," Margaret replied, "you become responsible for it." After the call ended, Nolan sat without moving. Luca rose and rested his head against Nolan's knee. That night, Nolan returned to the house alone with Luca. The snow had begun falling again, soft and steady. Inside, the warmth remained. Nolan walked the middle tier, running his fingers along the shelves, the beams, the carefully shaped walls. He stood before the warm section of wall once more. This time, he did not touch it. He whispered into the quiet, "What were you protecting, Ev?" The mountain did not answer, but Luca shifted closer, pressing his weight lightly against Nolan's leg, the way he always did when something unseen was near. Nolan knew then that Evelyn's silence had not been absence. It had been preparation. The first sign that something was changing came quietly. It was not the sound of engines. It was Luca refusing to cross the snow. Nolan noticed it on the third morning after discovering the house. The valley lay under a pale sky, the kind that made the world feel thin and hollow. Frost crusted the fence lines and clung to the dark needles of the pines. Nolan and Luca followed a narrow trail that cut across the eastern slope, a path Nolan had walked dozens of times during patrols. Halfway across the clearing, Luca slowed. His ears lifted. His tail stilled. His paws stopped. "Come on, boy," Nolan murmured. Luca did not move. Instead, the dog stepped backward, placing himself in front of Nolan's legs, his body forming a living barrier between Nolan and the snow-covered ground ahead. Nolan frowned. Luca had never done that before. That night, the wind shifted, and Luca rose from his place near the hearth, standing rigid as if pulled upright by an invisible thread. A low sound vibrated deep in his chest, not loud enough to wake the neighbors, but heavy enough to settle into Nolan's bones. "What do you hear?" Nolan whispered. Luca did not answer, of course. He never did. He simply listened. By the end of the week, the eastern ridge no longer felt like a mountain. It felt like something breathing under its skin. Nolan began marking the places Luca avoided. He sketched rough maps on a legal pad at the kitchen table, the pencil moving slowly as he connected each point. The narrow trail, the line of cedars, the shallow dip where snow always seemed thinner, the patch of ground where Luca refused to step, no matter how gently Nolan tugged on the leash. The pattern that formed was not random. It was a warning. The engines arrived 2 days later. Nolan heard them before he saw them, a distant mechanical hum echoing faintly through the trees. By midday, 2 survey trucks had pushed their way up the lower access road. Their tires bit into soil softened by recent thaw, leaving dark scars where the mountain had once been smooth and unbroken. The logo on the door read, "Iron Cliff Resource Group." Nolan parked the cruiser a quarter-mile away and approached on foot. Luca stayed close at his side, body angled toward the slope rather than the men, his ears tracking the pitch of the machinery. A man in his early 40s stood beside the larger truck, clipboard tucked under his arm. He was clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, wearing a new winter jacket that had never known real cold. His name was Daniel Pike, project supervisor. His handshake was firm, practiced. "Just running preliminary surveys," Pike said easily. "Copper deposits, standard procedure." Nolan looked past him at the drill head positioned too close to the ridge. "Standard doesn't mean safe," Nolan replied. Pike smiled, not unkindly. "We've got permits." Luca's hackles rose, not aggressively, carefully. That night, the ground trembled. Not enough to rattle dishes, enough to wake the dog. Luca rose instantly, muscles taut, and pressed himself against the inner wall of Nolan's house, his ears flattening then lifting again as if tracking something moving beneath the floor. Nolan followed him. He placed his hand against the wall. The vibration was subtle, but it was there. A low-frequency hum traveling through stone and bone. "Easy," Nolan whispered. The tremor passed. The silence that followed felt wrong. The next afternoon, Nolan drove to the ridge to investigate. Snow swirled lazily in the air, disguising the sound of his boots. Luca moved ahead, then suddenly lunged. Nolan felt the pull on the leash and stumbled just as the ground where he had been standing collapsed inward. Snow and rock slid down in a grinding roar. The earth gave way as though the mountain had exhaled too hard. Luca stood braced at the edge of the break, teeth still locked on Nolan's jacket. Nolan's heart slammed against his ribs. If the dog had hesitated, Nolan would have been gone. Men shouted from the ridge. The drill shut down. Daniel Pike stared at the collapse, his face pale beneath the windburn. "That shouldn't have happened," Pike muttered. "No," Nolan said, voice steady. "It shouldn't have been drilled." In the hours that followed, the tone of the mountain changed. The work slowed. The crews argued. Equipment sat idle while engineers rechecked measurements that no longer matched the ground beneath them. That night, Nolan returned to the house with Luca. Snow fell heavier now, softening the jagged scar on the slope. Inside, the warmth remained constant. Luca moved directly to the middle tier and lay down near the inner wall, the same place he had chosen days before. His body finally relaxed, breath slow and steady. Nolan watched him and understood something that had not yet taken words. Luca was not leading him. He was responding. And the mountain was speaking. Snow fell with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. It covered the scar on the mountainside as though trying to undo what men and machines had already begun. Nolan stood at the edge of the collapse long after the crews had pulled back, the silence of the forest settling around him. Luca remained close, his shoulder brushing Nolan's leg, amber eyes fixed on the slope that had nearly claimed him. The mountain had warned them. The dog had listened. Now Nolan had to decide what to do with that knowledge. He returned to the house before nightfall. Inside, the air was calm, unchanged by the chaos outside. He spread Evelyn's papers across the long wooden table on the middle tier. Old land surveys, climate models, handwritten notes in her careful script. The same handwriting she had used on grocery lists and birthday cards, the same steady curves, the same deliberate pressure. He read until the lantern's flame began to shrink. Evelyn had been preparing for this. She had known the structure's purpose, its vulnerability, the consequences of disturbing the mountain's balance. She had been gathering evidence for years, tracing fault lines, collecting case studies of failed developments, annotating articles about geothermal stability and slope integrity. Nolan could see the path of her thinking, the way her mind built systems instead of stories. For the first time since her death, Nolan felt close to her again. The next morning, he drove to the Forest Service station at the base of the valley. The building was low and weathered, its windows clouded by frost. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old paper. A man in his early 60s stood near the map table, his uniform worn thin at the cuffs, his gray beard trimmed short. His name was Marcus Hale, Senior Ranger. His eyes were pale blue and sharp, the kind of eyes that had learned to read terrain the way others read books. "You're the one with the dog," Marcus said. Nolan nodded. "They nearly lost you yesterday." "They nearly lost more than that," Nolan replied. Nolan spread Evelyn's documents across the table. Marcus studied them in silence, one thick finger tracing the fault lines, the airflow models, the cross-sections of the mountain. His jaw tightened as he read. "That house," Marcus said finally, "was built to fight winter, but it wasn't built to fight greed." Nolan met his gaze. "They drill again. The slope collapses." Marcus nodded once, "And it won't stop where it already broke." They contacted the county geological office that afternoon. Then the Environmental Review Board. Then a private structural engineer Nolan had known from an old case. The calls stacked up. So did the pressure. Daniel Pike from Ironcliff arrived before sunset. "We're increasing operations," Pike said, standing on the ridge with the wind tearing at his coat. "This incident only means we need better data." Nolan held out Evelyn's file. "You already have the wrong data." Pike's eyes flicked over the papers. His confidence dimmed, just slightly. "You don't own this mountain," Pike said. "No," Nolan replied. "But you don't control it either." The mountain answered for him that night. A tremor rolled through the valley after midnight. Subtle. Deep. Luca woke instantly, pressing himself against the inner wall of the house, ears flat, body rigid. Nolan placed his palm against the stone. The vibration passed through him, low and dangerous. Morning came with frost and sirens. A second collapse had occurred near the lower access road. No injuries. Enough damage to halt the work temporarily. The next 48 hours were a blur of meetings, inspections, paperwork, and arguments. Nolan watched the men in hard hats pace the slope, watched the engineers argue over instruments that contradicted one another. He walked the lines Luca refused to cross, marking each one on his maps. The pattern matched Evelyn's notes perfectly. By the third day, the county inspector arrived. Her name was Laura Penfield, mid-50s, compact, iron gray hair cropped close, eyes that missed nothing. She moved through the house slowly, hands in her coat pockets, pausing at the warm wall, at the ventilation channels, at the uneven temperatures between levels. "This isn't a cabin," she said. "It's a system." Nolan nodded. "And the system is under threat." They returned to the ridge together. Laura knelt beside the collapse, pressed her gloved hand to the fractured earth, then looked back at the slope above it. "I'll file my report," she said. "It won't be kind." Ironcliff did not leave quietly. Their lawyers arrived. Their letters followed. Terms like liability, access rights, and compliance measures appeared on heavy paper slid through Nolan's door. They wanted him gone, not by force, by decision. Marcus visited that evening. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Nolan at the table. "You could still walk away," Marcus said. Nolan shook his head. Evelyn didn't. Outside, Luca paced once, then settled near the door, his body finally at ease. Nolan looked at the maps, the notes, the mountain beyond the window. He understood the choice clearly now. He was not here to inherit a mystery. He was here to finish one. Winter did not leave the mountain when the papers were signed. It only changed its manner. The machines were removed one by one, their tracks slowly filling with snow. The bright flags marking survey points disappeared. The access road softened, its edges reclaimed by frost and pine needles. Silence returned to Silver Pine Valley with a gentleness that surprised everyone who had spent the last weeks bracing for more damage. Nolan Cross stayed. Not because he had nowhere else to go. Because he finally knew where he belonged. He moved his belongings into the house as the new year approached. A cot, a table, a lantern, boxes of canned food, a radio. The house accepted each addition without protest, its steady warmth unchanged, its walls holding the night at bay as they always had. Luca followed him everywhere, his tail low and relaxed now, the restless pacing that had haunted his sleep since the first tremor finally gone. Snow fell often, not in storms, in long, quiet hours. Nolan learned the rhythms of the place. He discovered that the upper tier warmed first in the late afternoon, when the weak winter sun touched the hidden channels behind the walls. The middle tier held heat through the night, releasing it slowly at dawn. The lower stone floor cooled last like the memory of yesterday's fire. He mapped it all. Not as an engineer, as a caretaker. Word began to spread. At first, it was a pair of hikers who lost their trail before dusk and followed Nolan's porch light through the trees. Then a truck that slid off the ridge during an early storm. Then a family stranded overnight when the road vanished beneath a white wall of wind. Nolan never turned anyone away. He cleared a room, brewed coffee, handed out blankets, listened more than he spoke. Luca became the mountain's messenger. The dog learned the trails better than any map. He found people buried beneath drifts. He stood guard through the night when the wind screamed too loud for sleep. He walked the edges of the ridge at dawn, nose low, tail steady, checking what the mountain was ready to give and what it still wanted kept. The valley changed around them, not dramatically, quietly. Marcus Hale retired from full patrol that spring, but visited often. He brought bread, tools, stories of old winters that had nearly swallowed the ridge whole. He liked sitting on the middle tier in the afternoon, hands wrapped around a mug, watching the light settle into the packed clay walls. "Some places," Marcus said once, "aren't meant to be owned." Nolan nodded. "This one isn't," he replied. "It's meant to be kept." Laura Penfield returned in early March without her clipboard. She walked the house slowly, boots leaving faint prints in the thin layer of snow Nolan had tracked inside. "They'll leave you alone now," she said. "Mostly." Nolan smiled faintly. Mostly is enough. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Nolan stepped outside with Luca. Snow drifted through the trees in slow spirals. The world felt smaller, kinder. Nolan thought of Evelyn, not of the accident, not of the hospital room, but of the woman who used to sit on their porch in summer, bare feet on the wood, asking questions about clouds and rivers and things people assumed were simple. He no longer felt the sharp edge of her absence. He felt her presence. Weeks passed, then months. By the following winter, the house was known throughout Silverpine Valley as the place you went when the storm was bigger than your fear. Nolan had built a small wooden sign near the trailhead. Winter shelter. No one turned away. The storms came again, and they were met. One night, during the deepest snowfall of the season, Nolan lay awake listening to the wind. The house did not shake. The walls did not crack. The warmth remained. Luca slept beside him, legs loose, breath slow, no longer lifting his head at every distant sound. Nolan closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he did not brace for impact. He dreamed of Evelyn standing at the edge of the ridge, dark hair loose around her shoulders, snow settling softly on her coat. She did not speak. She only looked at the house, then at him. When he woke, the dream did not cling. It passed like weather. Outside, dawn spread across the valley in pale gold. Nolan rose, pulled on his boots, and stepped onto the porch. The mountain lay quiet beneath the new snow. Luca joined him, sitting at the edge of the step, scanning the forest below out of habit, out of care. Nolan rested a hand on the dog's head. "Good morning," he whispered. The mountain did not answer. But it held. And in that holding, Nolan Cross found what he had not known he was searching for all along. Not happiness, not closure, balance. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. It does not arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes the miracle is quiet. It is the moment God places us exactly where we are needed. Nolan did not escape his pain. He stood inside it. And little by little, God turned that pain into purpose. The mountain was not removed from his life, but God taught him how to stand on it without falling. In our own lives, we often pray for the storm to disappear. But this story reminds us that God often works differently. He does not always change the weather, He changes the heart that is walking through it. If you are carrying grief, if you feel lost, if you feel tired of holding on, remember this: God is already working in the quiet places of your life, even when you cannot see it, even when you think you are alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal. May God bless you. May He protect your family, and may He guide your steps today and always. If you believe this message, type Amen in the comments.